Welcome to the INSEAD GCC Leadership Series, a new venture to come out of the INSEAD Emerging Markets podcast. I'm your host, Nick Mall, as always, and I'm here today with Zaid Mosawy, who is not only a very accomplished guest, he is someone who has lived an extraordinary life. He's held pivotal roles at top organizations like Atkins, Booz & Company, and the Supreme Committee for Delivery and Legacy in Qatar, where he was instrumental in delivering the FIFA World Cup in 2022. I'm looking forward not only to learn from his experience managing and building towards massive infrastructure and operational feats like the FIFA World Cup and London Olympics, but also into how hosting them can reshape cultures, economies, and entire regions. So I think before we get into all the exciting stories I'm sure you must have from launching the World Cup in Qatar and spending a whole decade on preparing for that, I'd love to learn more about who you were in your life before you got that opportunity and what had led up to it that made you the person to lead that extraordinary undertaking.
Well, great. Thanks very much for the intro, Nick. A great intro. I appreciate it. And thank you very much for inviting me onto this podcast. So yeah, my experience so far has been, as you said, quite diverse. I've done a number of different things, and I always believe in a positive way of thinking. So if you think positively, good things happen. And I think INSEADers, probably MBAs, but definitely INSEADers in general, we have this positive mental attitude and a belief that you can do things. And if you think about it, good things happen. So I've been very fortunate with having jobs that I love in my life, from starting off as a chartered civil engineer, building my way through Atkins and working on the London Olympics, to later deciding, okay, I want to go and do the MBA at INSEAD. And as you know, there's several steps to doing that. It's not an easy journey, but again, if you believe in something and you really want something, that you can make that happen. In my case, being British and British being what the British are, I only spoke one language. So I had to go to South America and learn Spanish in 6 months just to get into INSEAD. So it may be a bigger hurdle than most, but generally you see when people are accepted to INSEAD, there's a number of Americans or Australians or British people, asking on the forums where I can learn a language in 3 to 4 months. And we've all experienced that. But again, it's just belief in yourself, that as positivity and good things happen, and believing in yourself. And the World Cup's no different, really. I was on a golf course in London, just enjoying myself, probably not playing great, but out of the blue, I had a phone call from the Middle East. And somebody comes on the call and just says, hey, would you like to come for an interview for the World Cup in Qatar? And, again, I didn't approach anybody. Somebody found me on LinkedIn. They liked my profile. And in particular, the best way to probably answer the question that you had is why they found me or why they like me. I went through a number of interviews with them when I was in Doha, but they asked me why I thought I was good for the job in the end. And, I highlighted I'd become a chartered civil engineer. I'd been chartered within 4 years and worked on a number of different projects. And they were building 8 stadiums and they were developing their whole country's infrastructure from scratch. So having this civil engineering background was certainly something that they valued. Moving on to that, I then talked about the fact that I'd worked on the London Olympics. And as part of working on the London Olympics, I was there for 5-6 years. And again, I was dealing with multidisciplinary engineering teams working on developing the Olympic Park, as it's called. And Atkins was in charge of the north part, and I was making sure that everybody was communicating with everyone. Engineers generally tend to put their heads down and focus on what's in front of them to do their designs, and the communication with other teams tends to be quite different and difficult for them. I, on the other hand, like communicating. And so I was put in a role to communicate with everybody and make sure that if somebody moved their stadium, everyone was aware of it, because that would have implications with everything else that everyone else was doing. But certainly the Olympics had a big push because the Qataris really valued London 2012. They won the bid in 2010. They'd had a year to think things through. And at that time, London was the new benchmark. It was best practice. It was how to deliver a mega event. And so they were looking at people who was just coming off London or who was aware of how things were done in London. Then my INSEAD experience, they loved the brand of INSEAD. They like people from INSEAD. And so, I always say about INSEAD, there's 3 great things. One is the stuff that you learn, which is probably the least important. Then there's the brand itself, which goes on your CV and hopefully, it worked for me. People found me on LinkedIn. And then finally, it's the people that you come across. And it's not only your own promotion, which are great and amazing people who have story after story. I mean, you guys doing this INSEAD Emerging Markets podcast, you've got thousands of people just in INSEAD to speak to who have all got these unbelievable stories. So you've tapped into something quite unique, I think, and I'm sure you're going to have many, many interesting podcasts to come for sure. But yeah, from my side, the experience with INSEAD, and I'd worked for a top management consultancy firm, Booz in London, and having that experience under my belt allowed me to go into the strategy team as part of the World Cup in Qatar with 10 years to go. So it was quite a long period, but it was an exciting period. And when I responded with that as my answer, they were still looking for more. So on top of that, I'd played England's boys football, or soccer for you, Nick. So I had a really deep understanding of football itself. I'm from Manchester, Manchester United, some might say Manchester City now, but Manchester United are the big brand of football. And that's something that always excites me. So to get an opportunity to come and work on a football World Cup in the Middle East, I'm half Iraqi, so there's a link there as well, allowed so many different factors in my background to all come together, which allowed it all to give me the best opportunity possible to work on such a unique and exciting project.
Amazing. Yeah, definitely want to go into how that experience was and why you decided to take it. But I want to also go back to something that you said earlier, which was the power of positive thinking. I think a lot of us from the MBA background, we try to be very analytical about everything. And maybe something like that might sound sort of woo-woo or whatever. But as I've gotten older, I've also definitely seen that your mindset really does shift your reality. And what ends up happening is very correlated with the way that you approach the world. And so I was curious if that's just an innate trait that you had, that you're just always a pretty optimistic person, or was it something that you cultivated over time? You realized that you needed to think more positively, and then that started impacting your life?
So yeah, great question. I think everyone's different. So some people just generally depends on their upbringing or depends on their natural personalities. We've all done the ENTJ, your personality profiles, etc. And yeah, people think in different ways. And so some people have to actively try and be more positive, and some people just are positive. Some people are a little bit too positive and they need to sort of rein it in a little bit from time to time. But from my own perspective, I've generally always been a positive person. I think that came through sport, actually. So circling back to sport in general, it brings a lot of confidence with you. I was thankfully naturally good at sport, and in particular soccer as well. And through that, and have gained the confidence of working with people, that brings a lot of confidence, which can then come into education and then later into your career as well. I think you see quite a few top sportsmen who are using those leadership skills that they've taken from the field, especially in team sports, and then bringing that through into their career at a later point. But from my side, working on something that you love and knowing when to change when you don't love it as much anymore, all of these things are important. And you only live once at the end of the day. So kind of like carpe diem, seize the day and enjoy it.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, playing American football when I was younger, it's still one of the experiences that I go back to whenever I think I'm going through something difficult, and I remember overcoming the difficulties there. It teaches you so much, whether it's working with a team or just overcoming physical challenges, which are really mental challenges. And I think anything you do in your life after that just becomes easier when you do have that experience. So
definitely
100% on board with that. Shifting over to your work in the World Cup, I know they recruited you 10 years before the actual event happened. I was wondering if you could talk about that whole process. I mean, probably when you joined, it was just an idea. It was a smaller group of people, and then it turned into a huge global event that really shifted a whole country's trajectory. So maybe just walking from the beginning until the event was actually hosted, I'd love to hear what it was to create something that large just from the small group that you started with.
Yeah, I mean, it's a massive project, and, 13 years of my life to date. And so I'll try and condense as much as I can for the purpose of this podcast. But I mean, literally from the interview, I'll be honest with you, going over to Qatar, it was already a really interesting country. I mean, the Middle East is a really vibrant, interesting place. Going there for me, even though I'm half Iraqi, going there for the first time properly to, consider living there and seeing the infrastructure that was already in place, the great hotels that they had in place, the new airport that was being developed, etc. It gave you a sense of, wow, something's really happening here. On top of that, they had something called the 2030 vision, which is obviously still in play because we've got a few years to 2030 to go. But at that time, it just kind of been written and put together. And I really liked reading that. I read it as part of my brief. I thought to myself, why doesn't the UK have a 2030 vision? And it might do, but it wasn't really obvious. And, when you're looking at the Western democracy, it changes every 4 years. You get a different polity that comes into place. So it's really difficult to get a vision, maintain a vision and move towards it so that the citizens, the residents of that said country can feel part of that movement towards something in the long term. But Qatar put something down on paper, to actually say this is the direction we want to go, and the projects that we will be working on across all our ministries will be moving into those different pillars that they'd identified. So I found that quite interesting, having a strategic mindset myself and liking structure, that they'd actually put that down and allowed you to understand, that's why they've made this decision, or, that links to this particular goal, rather than it just seeming what generally politics looks like, which is a playground and everybody's sort of making random calls and you're not really too sure why. So both the country itself and, the vision that it had and the aspirations and the fact that it had won the World Cup itself really drove me to wanting to be part of this journey. I was one of the first people to be hired after the bid. So I joined a team of around about 70 people in 2012. By the time we got to 2022, we were over 4,000. So that team grew quite large. So we're now back down to closer to around 300 people. And so it's like a huge startup, if you will. And we had 10 years to go through that startup, and other people only have 6 years to go through that startup. But imagine your org structure constantly changing and fluctuating. Different people being assigned different roles and responsibilities, having to understand whether somebody can actually do the role, but you don't have a year to assess them. You only have 3 or 4 months to assess them, and then you either stick or you move on. There's lots of organizational change elements that come as part of these major events, whether it's the Olympics, whether it's the World Cup or other events in themselves as well. But working with major stakeholders in your country as well. Each World Cup is just really, really different. And, each one will have different goals and responsibilities. And we worked the best we could to figure out what those goals were and work with our stakeholders to deliver that. I can go into a bit more detail if you want in terms of how the strategic thinking was, but there were so many different variables on that 10-year or 12-year journey that it now is, that it's difficult to condense into one specific point. But yeah, it was great in terms of building up to something. It was great in the fact that whenever I mentioned what my job was, whoever I was speaking to, it wasn't like I said I was a management consultant and then people switch off and yawn, or it wasn't like I was a attorney or so. It's like, when I mentioned I worked on the FIFA World Cup in Qatar, everyone leaned forward, everybody had questions, everybody was excited. And that's another reason why I kind of loved my job. I thought it was interesting, but so other people did too.
Definitely. I think just following your curiosity and interest leads to good things a lot of times. And also to your earlier point, that's the reason I'm doing this podcast. Is kind of the reason I went to INSEAD and left the US. Just the emerging market countries, people are just much more optimistic. They're concrete plans for the future. Whereas in the Western world, there's a lot of people fighting about politics and everything's changing every 4 years, or I guess in the US, at least it's 4 years. In the UK may be a different timeline. And the Middle East GCC countries, I think, embody that more than anywhere else, where they really are building for the future. And that is why it's such an exciting part of the world to be right now. One thing that I am curious about is that there's also a lot of negative press in the West about that part of the world. I think when the World Cup in Qatar happened, there were stories that came out. Some of them may have been more true than others about different issues that were happening there in terms of the treatment of workers, et cetera. I was wondering how you dealt with those challenges presenting the World Cup to the rest of the world when there was that sort of negative impression of the region from the Western world.
Yeah, so great question. And it's something that a lot of people spoke about, and it's more through communicating our side of the story than the media side. And I certainly took on a different view of the media whilst I was working in Qatar. Again, these are my own personal views, but I found a lot of the stories seem to repeat themselves quite often. And I was wondering, why are these people writing these stories? And in the end, I just put it down to journalists getting paid to write stories at the end of the day. And so a lot of this press, which was built up on putting pressure on Qatar, wasn't necessarily coming from the journalists themselves, but they were being lobbied to write stories about Qatar in themselves. But that's a sidetrack. When planning for a tournament, you really need to understand what your goals are. And part of that is your communication strategy and how you're going to set up for that. And that's really key. For me, the way I think about it is that when the final whistle goes at the end of the World Cup, what are the 3 to 5 things that people think about your tournament at the end of that? And having a cool, clear strategy that links with higher authorities, whether it's a president or a royal family, and what their priorities were of what they want people to believe in. All of that needs to come through. 10 years is a long time working with people, but you need to be prepared for not only having these goals and these clear strategies and working towards them, but be aware that change or risk or different things are going to happen, which you may not have expected. So when you're looking at the negative press from our side, we have negative press across a few different areas, but one of the main ones was workers' welfare, and that's the workers who are working to build the stadiums. We had negative press directly from the media, but we also had a lot of things said by specialized NGOs who work in this particular field. I was really fortunate to be part of this and see it firsthand exactly what happened, but I worked directly for the Secretary General, who's kind of like the CEO of the World Cup, and he was representative and speaking to these different NGOs on a regular basis. And what started out as a negative story with the NGOs, which they do at all World Cups, they've been to South Africa and they were lobbying for change there. They were in Russia lobbying for change there. So it's not just that Qatar was singled out. It happens across all the different major tournaments that NGOs see having the spotlight put on these countries as an opportunity to make positive change. I think in a way, a positive thing, and we can talk about that a little later on the podcast. But, we went from lots of negative things being said about us to, by the end of it, working as a partnership, working with the NGOs coming in, working alongside us on a day-by-day basis to improve workers' conditions and everything from the whole life cycle of workers, from when they are in their own country and how they get selected to come over to work overseas. That in itself is a toxic environment, to making their way over, signing a contract, working in whichever country they may be working in to make sure that their living circumstances are as good as possible, and the food and the housing is up to international best practice, to finally when they're repatriating back home. It's a full life cycle that we spent a lot of time and effort really understanding and trying to improve across all the different areas. And by the end of it, the same people who in 2012 to 2015 were telling us, it's a disgrace and there were so many issues with what's happening in Qatar. At the end of it, they were turning around saying Qatar's best practice. We ended up passing 11 new labour laws in the country. So it wasn't just something for the tournament, but it's something that's dramatically changed the infrastructure and way Qatar's Ministry of Labour looks at workers' welfare in the country, and lots of positive change working together. The main media story that came out of this was that a particular British company, I think, a British newspaper, it's usually British media, they tend to be quite difficult in some cases. Again, my own personal view. It came up with a story that 6,000 people were going to die on this World Cup, which was far and away much higher than any other previous World Cup. And a lot of people had quoted that. And even by the time they came to the World Cup, they still had that number in their mind. And, it was just a story that had been made up to generate headlines. They'd taken all of the people who had been killed or who had died in Qatar over a period of a year from 6 different nations, and then extrapolated that over 12 years, regardless of whether they were working on the tournament or not, and said, okay, that's the number of people that have died on the Qatar World Cup. We had 6 deaths, unfortunately, associated with the infrastructure build on the tournament, which was far lower than a number of other mega events that had taken place. We did research all the way back to 2000 with Sydney, and I think it was only Sydney and London that had less. So when you're building massive infrastructure projects, civil engineering as itself, they have a huge health and safety element, and implications of that are because it's a dangerous profession. And unfortunately, 6 people were unlucky to pass away on our tournament. But there was lots of positive change that can hopefully lead to positive outcomes for future people working in Qatar and in future host countries as well.
Sure. I mean, it's probably not the only reason that you took the job, but I think that is really cool about these major events is that you can affect huge social change or cultural change. And whether it's just in Qatar or globally in terms of the way workers' welfare is handled for events or just in general in a lot of these countries where there are a lot of migrant workers, it always has been an issue. And if you bring a spotlight to it and are able to implement new best practices, I think that's a huge, major impact that you can make on the world. That is really cool that you're able to be part of that. I was wondering if there are any other major social or cultural shifts in Qatar that you think happened as a result of this World Cup, and just maybe if you just speak a little bit more to how these sort of events can shift a society and a culture in a country that hosts them.
Yeah, I mean, so I think sport in general has a huge opportunity, not even an opportunity. It's been doing it for years and years, thousands of years, really, in improving the way that people live. An example being sports diplomacy. It's a term that's been used in the past, but the Olympics itself, when it was on, thousands of years ago in ancient Greece, whenever the Olympics took place, whatever wars were happening or battles were happening at that time, got paused and people went and competed against each other. And through that, communicated with each other. And those communications brought a closeness and a camaraderie, which allowed people to understand each cultures, allowed people to understand people's different way of thinking. And that's not changed to this day. There's been other instances more recently of sports diplomacy that happened. North and South Korea as part of their Winter Olympics. Back in the 70s, I think there was ping pong diplomacy where the Americans sent a team of ping pong players over to China to improve relationships there. Dennis Rodman's been in North Korea, I think, doing different things himself. So again, trying to make it, I'm trying to Americanize some of this, but it really shows. And what we noticed on the World Cup is this was the first time that the World Cup had been hosted in Qatar. We were the smallest tournament ever. We were awarded 10 years before the World Cup was supposed to take place for the first time. The first time it'd been moved to a November-December World Cup. And we had Arab teams reaching the semi-finals. We had huge, crazy games in the group stages where Saudi Arabia beat Argentina. So it was an opportunity where cultures came together and people got to experience not just Qatar, but the Middle East as a whole and understand what that culture is and experience firsthand the quite a generous culture that the Middle East is. It's quite a welcoming culture. You come in and you're greeted with smiles, you're greeted with good food, and people want to really help you and be there for you. And unfortunately, again, the media paints the Middle East in a very different way. And so people have perceptions based on this. But once you've been there and lived it, then you can really start to understand a culture a lot more. And we managed to do that as part of the World Cup. So a big social element was not just the local positive change from a cultural side of things, but it was the international change for people understanding the region better as a whole as well. And then we paved the way, obviously, for other events to take place in the future. And we can talk about Saudi 2034 later on, but even Morocco, they've won with Spain and Portugal in 2030 as well. So there is quite a positive shift that came from Qatar being the guinea pigs, if you will, to lead the way, to push the frontier, to take on all that criticism and bring out the positives because of it. And that's brought about a lot of positive change for the region. And hopefully we're looking forward to some really interesting tournaments coming up in the future with Morocco and Saudi as well. Some other changes that we mentioned as well, some other big things to talk about. I could talk about things all day, to be honest. So it depends how much time you have. Obviously, the skills and the capabilities in the country, they improve as well. So you go from a country that hadn't delivered anything on the scale before to now they've delivered a World Cup. So any mega event that comes along in the future, we've got people in the country that can deliver huge events. They built 8 stadiums in 8-9 years. So we've got huge experience now in the construction market, making sure that the local skills got upgraded and the local companies' skill sets have improved because of that. So there's a confidence that's just come with all of the work that's happened in Qatar as well, for everybody being part of this. Everyone just feeling happier with the infrastructure that was built here. So around $200 billion was spent on infrastructure that would have taken place anyway, such as the metro being developed, such as the airport being developed. But the World Cup acted as a catalyst here to make sure that things moved along faster. So people got to experience these mega projects finishing on time to high standards and being able to use them a little sooner. But I'd say the final thing, which I really loved, which moves us on to a slightly different topic, but I think you'll have stuff to talk about here, was in relation to when we started talking to the UN a little bit about sport again. And it's about sport making a difference. And I'm going to keep coming back to that, whether it's the Olympics, the World Cup, or even just, a regular paddle game or whatever you want to do. But we spoke with the UN in respect to their refugee program, and we were quite keen on the fact that obviously they do great work. They have different pillars, and shelter's a pillar, food's a pillar, water's a pillar, and so they're always around to make sure that things are done the right way. So when we were looking at issues in Syria and issues in Afghanistan in the region, there's quite a lot of refugees that were flowing out of these countries because of these issues. And we were lobbying in a way, or having a conversation with the UN about them including sport as part of, one of their pillars that they need to include. Health is obviously another one, because you found that these refugee camps, they had the shelter, they had the food, they had the drink, but they were in them for some time, and there was no way for people to enjoy themselves in any way, or to, do activity that brings people together. So we asked that we could go and build some football pitches in some of the refugee camps that had been set up, which then obviously had the additional benefits that come with doing exercise and playing soccer in these sorts of environments. So I think that they saw the positives of that. They never actually came to being included as a distinct pillar itself, but there was something really positive from that. We ended up building a program called Generation Amazing, which was from the bid, which went around building football pitches around the world in deprived communities, which not only did they build football pitch, but then you train the local talent and leaders to then give, football sessions so that they can focus on a slightly different career and bring the community together, which might normally be bored and turn to crime of some sorts, but instead their community is built around a football pitch instead. So lots of side stories that we were working on during this 10-year period, but there's a lot of positive things that can be done from such a unique experience.
I'm sure, and it's really cool that you were part of that as well. I mean, we talked about the benefits of sport already, but being able to give people an outlet, it's great for their mental health, it's great for building their communities. And especially if you're bringing high profile people, that always just, whether or not the actual content of what the person says, I think it all just means a lot to people from whatever community they're from, to have someone like that come in and show that they care. So that is really cool that you were able to do that. You mentioned briefly that this also kind of led the groundwork for places like Morocco or Saudi Arabia. I was wondering if you have any predictions for, given what's happened in Qatar, how do you think the 2034 World Cup will impact society, culture, and Saudi going forward?
So super cool question. Obviously, Saudi have only just been confirmed as the 2034 hosts. And also, to be honest, Spain, Portugal, and Morocco bid. I mean, just briefly talking about that before we move on to Saudi, we assessed the Morocco bid when it was up against the United bid. So Morocco was the only bidder to go up against the United States, Canada, and Morocco, and two very different bids. And we got the opportunity to look at both documents because people were being more transparent with the work that they were doing. And I think it was the fifth time Morocco had bid. So it's a massive footballing nation that were really keen on hosting this tournament. And the main thing stood out that, the infrastructure just wasn't quite there yet. But one of our recommendations that came from the review, and we went and spoke with the team in charge of the Morocco bid, was that, potentially they could team up with Spain and Portugal, because then you get the European bids as part of the FIFA decision making, because you get bids from different confederations and you have to pick up the votes from different confederations. So you get the African vote, you get the European vote, and being able to combine Morocco with Spain, Portugal, I think is going to be a really, really exciting World Cup. Each World Cup's really, really different, and it's up to the organisers to understand what's important to them. But like I said, for Morocco in itself, I can't wait to see how that turns out. For Saudi Arabia, some people might think, it's quite similar to Qatar's. I mean, we've certainly started things off, but I hope that Saudi Arabia can take things on as well. They've started really strongly. The country's clearly opening up in general. They've established the Saudi Premier League. So that's something that's a huge investment from their side. They've also gone big on women's football. So they're starting to develop women's football in Saudi Arabia already. And that's 10 years to go. So I'm really excited to see where that gets to in 10 years' time, to see how things change from where we are now to, again, through sport, social change coming, which, it doesn't have to be pushed on people, but it's just naturally absorbed through sport. I set up a community football league in Qatar. There wasn't a grassroots league in Qatar at the time. And it started off with independent teams, like a team from Morocco playing a team against Scotland, a team against Spain, and these were just residents who were living there. By the end of the third year, you had Spanish people playing with Scottish people, playing with people from Africa playing with everyone. It was the better players playing with the better players and the worst players and which is what it should be. And what started off as quite a segregated communities league, so separate communities, we became one community league. And I think that Saudi Arabia, certainly on the football side, they're a huge footballing nation and a much bigger population than Qatar. So I think there's a big opportunity for social change through football and sport. They've already been lobbied already about their workers' welfare, exactly as Qatar was doing. And, people talk about sports washing when it comes to Saudi Arabia as well. And I really don't like that term, because at the end of the day, if the US does it or if the UK does it, it's fine. But for some reason, if an emerging country is doing something which is breaking the natural trend, then it's looked down on. Whereas actually, if you bid for a World Cup or if you bid for an Olympics, you're putting the spotlight on yourselves. So you're doing kind of the opposite of what these people are saying is happening, and you're ready for that, and you're ready for change, and you're ready to move along. And I'm sure that the Saudis will work together with the different NGOs just as we did and make the relevant changes as required. And I think all I can see is positivity from that happening as well. Finally, just in terms of the tournament, it's going to be a bigger tournament because there's 48 teams now in the next 3 versions of the World Cup. So a lot more people come into the region again to understand the region once again. If you've had a look at the stadiums online for Saudi Arabia, they just look insane. They look like they're from the future. Like one's 250 meters in the air or something like that in one of the structures. So just really exciting, again, project to come from. And even comes from your question, Nick. I mean, you've got the United World Cup that's happening in 2 years' time. You've not mentioned that. You've got the Morocco and Spain and Portugal, and that's kind of okay, but not really that bothered. But, people are already talking about the Saudi bid and what that impact can have. And that's why I think it's really positive that we look on these chances as opportunities for people to understand each other and change a region, if you will, for everyone to understand each other, basically, that little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it definitely gives people the opportunity to do that, putting the country in the spotlight. And whether it's through the media or all the people who visit, it just allows the country to be a new place. And it also puts it in a new way of understanding it for the rest of the world. I guess getting to the event itself, I'd love to talk more about the compact nature of Qatar and how that may have differentiated it from other World Cups that were either in much larger countries or spread across different countries. What were the benefits of that? How do you see that affecting World Cups going forward in the future?
Yeah, so I mean, it was one of our things that we highlighted from the start. I mean, ours was the smallest World Cup on record since 2030 when it was hosted in Uruguay. Our tournament to get to any stadium was just a car ride away. So we talk about sustainability these days, which we've not even touched on really here. There were no internal flights for games. People came on the day, they stayed in one hotel. And from a fan perspective, they could stay in one hotel. They can go from one game. If they fancy going to another game a few hours later and they can get tickets, they can go to another game. All the stadiums were full all of the time because you've got what FIFA called a football playground of, people being able to just get to wherever they need to within an hour of going from one stadium to the other stadium, whether it's by taxi or by coach or by metro. And it was a really sustainable way to do a World Cup. I mean, the United bid is very, very different. It's spread over Canada, the US, and Mexico. Very, very different. There's lots of positives associated with that. But the flights between all of these different places certainly create a problem from a sustainable perspective, which is one of the negatives about such a tournament being held in that way. But also it makes it difficult for fans to move around and the cost elements associated with that. One of the intricacies, which people don't really notice, but we notice for other World Cups as well, is that depending on where you finish in your group, it dictates what city you're going to next. So if you come top, you go to City A, which is over on the East Coast. If you come second, you're on City Y, which is in Mexico, and you can't buy both sets of tickets and both sets of accommodation and be ready for all of that. So our World Cup meant that you didn't have to think that far ahead, and it wasn't incurring all of these additional costs on the fans. And, no matter where you came, you had a plan and you could think things through. Now, that was just the fans themselves. The players finished the game. Within 1 hour, they're back in the hotel. They're in the sauna. They're relaxing. Their legs are freshening up. So whereas normally most other World Cups, they have to fly back to wherever they're going. They're on these tight seats on the plane. They don't have a real chance to properly relax their legs. And this showed in the stats as part of the World Cup itself. I mean, we had the most goals ever in a tournament. So we had 172 goals in our crazy tournament, which at the end of the day, I mean, again, it's America. So you guys are thinking when it comes to basketball, 172 points, that's what we get in a game. Why do I need 172 goals across the tournament? But, it's just crazy amounts of goals because people could recover a lot faster. And they weren't having to fly from place to place as well. They were relaxed. They could be with their families. And again, it's a month period for them as well. So that all culminated in the final where, voted best final of all time. Gianni Infantino told us it was the best group stage of all time. Then he told us it was the best World Cup of all time. And then finally there was like votes after votes of people saying which was the best World Cup of all time. And Qatar's coming out top across the world. So it was an amazing way to finish the tournament that you'd worked for. And that's something that you can't plan. You can put everything in place to allow that to happen. But when something like that happens, again, positive thinking, hopefully comes with positive endings as well. And that certainly shone through. I myself, again, a quick side story, probably shouldn't mention it. Friends have told me not to mention this before, but, it got to the extra time for the World Cup and I'd arranged a restaurant for my boss's guests to be at. And when it went to extra time, they were calling me up. They were going to release the table. They were going to do X and Y. So when the goal went in and it went to 3-2 to Argentina in extra time, I thought, okay, that's it. So I left the stadium because I had to go and prepare for my boss and make sure the restaurant was all fixed and they weren't going to take our table away. At which point, the rest is history. And I missed probably one of the most nail-biting finals ever. But c'est la vie. The rest of it was very, very good. I did go to see some good games.
Sure. Shows your commitment to success no matter what. And it absolutely was one of the best World Cups ever. So whether it was the compact nature or positive thinking or whatever else, it worked out really well. And that is a really good point. With fans in mind, with sustainability in mind, with the players in mind. We have the college football playoff for the first time in the US happening right now. And I've heard people talking, if my team wins, then I have to spend thousands of dollars. But just because you don't know, I might have to fly somewhere and get hotels and everything at the last minute. And so if you are in a much more compact country, you don't have to deal with all of that. I think just as we wrap up here, I have maybe a couple more questions. One would be, are there any other lessons you think the sporting event industry in general has taken away from the Qatar World Cup? And how do you see them impacting the future of the industry?
So the industry as a whole, sport has been changing massively over the last 10 15 years. Sponsorship rights, marketing rights, have been going through the roof. Team valuations have been going through the roof. A lot more people are getting involved in being owners of the different teams as well. New sports have been arriving. Paddle is, what do you guys have? Something ball? Pickleball. Yeah. But,
Pickleball,
yeah. Yeah. We've got paddle over here and, these sorts of different sports events are popping up and people are trying different ways to see how you can change sport as a general to generate revenues. Because at the end of the day, people love watching sport. If you watch Drive to Survive, the background stories of, these sports, what's happening in the background, people are really excited about as well. And there's just so many mediums. I think that for the longest time, no one's really touched upon. And now through both entertainment and sport, it's coming together as one so that it's something that people play and enjoy and go to see. But also then it becomes an entertainment package, which is being built out across many different levels. One, for the enjoyment of the fan, but also commercialization is driving a lot of this. When it comes to mega events such as the World Cup and the Olympics is pushing a lot more for a sustainable Olympics. So I know that LA's done an amazing job. They're making sure that they don't build anything for their LA Olympics, and they're going to try and make it the most sustainable ever, which is great. And I know that for FIFA, they're pushing, again, each of the different bids are for different reasons. So for the US, Canada, and Mexico, less for Mexico, it's about pushing the sport out to other untapped markets so that more and more people play. That'll link into the MLS. Having Messi in the MLS is obviously driving more people to attend and watch, and women's football as well. That you guys have been the world champions for so many years as well. And that's just starting to catch on, across the globe. So in the last 2-3 years, Women's soccer has been, growing immensely as well. So there's a lot of change happening in sport, and just being part of that ecosystem is a really exciting place to be. And being somebody that enjoys sport as well, it's just a sweet spot and a lovely way for your career to be headed, even though sometimes you don't plan these things. They just happen that way. So I think that's probably it for now from my side. But I'd say that the Middle East, they'll continue to keep developing. They've seen the positivity that came from Qatar, and even against all the odds and all the naysayers and all of the media, such a positive story that came away from it. There was a positive economic impact. There was a positive social impact, a human impact, and even from an environmental side of things, lots of positive things were done in relation to the tournament, which reflects well on the region. And I'm just hoping that other emerging countries are given the same opportunity, and it doesn't just go to first world countries that show an event, everyone turns up, watches it, and then everyone goes home, and there's no real strong legacy that comes from that afterwards.
Amazing, super fascinating discussion. And I think that you probably changed a lot of people's minds, gave people new perspectives that they may not have heard before, and really enjoyed talking to you. So thank you so much for your time, Zaid.
My pleasure. And I'd say just from my side, signing off, if you've not been to a World Cup before, get yourself an opportunity to go along. And if it's not a World Cup, go along to something that excites you, because getting that buzz that comes from these experiences are special times and something that you'll always remember. Certainly our guests remembered being able to go to 4 games in one day, the buzz and the excitement of not knowing where to go, what to do. It's a unique opportunity, and I'm looking forward to seeing what the United World Cup looks like, seeing what happens in Morocco and Spain and Portugal, and really excited to see what's happening in Saudi and how they move forward. And maybe we can have another talk in 10 years and see whether this podcast can lead into us predicting how things would go in Saudi in 2034. Or I'll just see you guys in 2034 and we can go and watch the games together.
Yeah, that sounds like a better plan. I'm looking forward. Catch you up in person.
Thanks, guys.
All right, thanks so much. Talk to you soon. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the INSEAD Emerging Markets Podcast. To stay up to date on events we may be hosting, emerging market news, and to build your personal network, please feel free to join the INSEAD Alumni Emerging Markets Interest Group on LinkedIn.